Greetings, Earthlings. We are the Metrons. We come from the galaxy of Metron. We have been informed by our High Commander that our sworn intergalactic enemies, the Metalunans, have come to you with a proposal of being able to fix everything in your society. We want to warn you away from them. They are only liars and deceivers. In your Earthman vernacular, they are lying sacks of shit. They will produce nothing for you. We, on the other hand, with our great mothership, will provide you with all the resources you need to get over this pandemic. The first thing, though, is that we come to approach you, first of all, due to the fact that we know that your elected officials and your state-sponsored scientists are giving you a bunch of malarkey. So the first thing that we're going to do when we come down is eliminate and disintegrate all of that. Disintegrate, exterminate, exterminate, exterminate. We will do it for you, and then we can get to business. Thank you. For all of you NSA or FBI agents out there that are currently watching the program, and I know you're out there, I know you love to watch the show, I'm glad you're watching the show. I'm glad you're watching the lectures because maybe you'll learn something. But the whole thing about disintegrating elected officials, that's a joke, that's a skit. The Metrons made me do it. The Metrons made me do it. The Metrons made me do it. In federal district court today, Bongiorno appeared dressed as what he termed a Metron. So, anyway, we have to gotta get to business here. Gotta get to business. By the way, for you sci-fi fans, those references to the Metrons I stole from Star Trek. They appeared in one of the original Star Trek episodes called Arena, in which Captain Kirk fights the Gorn, which was awesome. And the Metalunans actually appear in a film that was on Svengoolie last Saturday called This Island Earth. They have these big craniums. It's a classic sci-fi tale with some great makeup effects. You need to see it. So, let's do that. I just can't stop. It's defective, too, by the way. It's like, all right, so let's get to work. Let's get back to where we were. And finally, engaging with the actual text of Society of the Spectacle, but I just want to do a little bit more back history on the history of these various financial collapses of cap. Let's get rid of this. Also, bullet points galore. Not laser points, but bullet points. Douglas Lane, collaborate chat with Douglas Lane. Tuesday, I will make sure that the session is all put in place. I'm going to record it for those of you. I've gotten one or two. Better not be a drove of people that said that they can't log on at that time. That's cool because I'm going to videotape it
and then I'm going to put it, I'm not going to videotape, I'm going to record it, and then I'm going to use it, put it as a blog entry. Douglas Lane, he's a well-known podcaster and author, and we've been doing some back and forth talking about Society of the Spectacle. And he's a very interesting guy. He's written some books that I didn't even know about, and he should be interesting. So you guys got the podcast link too. You should check out some of his podcasts to find out what's going on with all and sundry. You know, the upcoming elections and politics and COVID-19 and the way this whole, let's call it what it is, folks, a clusterfuck is shaping up. So he's going to be Tuesday. So we're going to be logging in and we're going to be talking with him. And you should, for extra credit, you should have a question for Doug for the last period of the chat. It will be mostly a kind of back and forth with him, and then I'll just open the floor up like I usually do with guest speakers. And then on that same day, your first draft of the midterm needs to come in. You know, when I say first draft, you know, it's like you should just do due diligence and try to get it as finalized as you can. You know, and then what I'm going to ultimately do is print them out, correct them, scan them, and then send them back to you shortly after that, which is going to be a bear of a couple of days because they also have papers coming in from Mass Media Research. They got their book reports due, so a bunch of journalists is going to be like, you know, swimming in work like he usually is. Let's get back to what we were talking about. Want to go back and talk about we were talking about the rise of capitalism in this country and how and why it grew and thrived with such power in this country, and then what went wrong with the outsourcing and the automation, and how wages stayed flat and have stayed flat since the mid-1970s. We talked about where that money went and how that money was utilized and this whole creation of the super rich class and how it all kind of came raining down in 2008, and how now in 2020 it seems as if we're in a situation not unlike that and possibly even more catastrophic. Want to talk about another Great Depression, of the one of 1929 that went for a period of time between like 29 and actually it went for the historical markers for that were like 29 to like 37 when FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, got into office in 33, I believe. What did FDR do to stop the Great Depression? How did he deal with it? The first, and it's a very, very interesting point in historical, in our history, because what he did was create, first of all, he surrounded himself with the best and the brightest people, both men and women. If you want to read a really great book about this, read a book by Michael Hitzlick about the New Deal, which I recently read. It's a bear of a book, but it's definitely worth reading because it was men and women. Some of the people who were instrumental in making the New Deal happen were women. And a few of the things that he did, a few of the things that he ended up doing that people kind of, you know, with no sense of history kind of forget. There were three primary things that he did to offset the Depression. Number one was that he instituted unemployment insurance. There had never been any kind of safety net in this country before that for people who had lost their jobs, right? Everybody that's current, and he did that. He put that into place. Unemployment insurance, all right? What some of you are relying on today and filing for today, it was all because of Roosevelt, all because FDR put unemployment insurance in place as a safety net for people when they lost their jobs, right? And there were a lot of people out of work. As many, if not more, than what are currently out of work right now. So first he creates unemployment insurance, which was a mind-boggler for most people. You know, the second thing he did, and this was in a matter of like a week, all right? The second thing he does is creates Social Security. He creates a Social Security fund. Another thing that we had never seen in this country up until Roosevelt. You know, there was no safety net for people after they had reached retirement, for the elderly. This whole Social Security income that we've tapped into and depleted in all kinds of ugly ways, and I don't want to go into that, but Roosevelt's the guy that came up with it. You know, you reach a certain age, you start getting paid by the government to be able to live and survive on top of whatever other savings or pensions you have. You have Social Security. A lot of people a lot of elderly people derive their sole income from Social Security. He did that. Put these couple things into place in a matter of days, if not weeks, if not days. Third thing, put 12.5 people to work in federally subsidized jobs. 12.5 unemployed people were given work through the New Deal. All right, in all sectors of life, and we've talked about this before. Through this, what they call the Civilian Conservation Corps, and all these public works programs, construction. We built highways, we built dams. They worked on state parks. You know, Civilian Conservation Corps was instrumental in putting together things in our state parks. It also funded the arts for creative people. There was this whole thing called the Works Progress Authority, in which artists and writers and people like Orson Welles, the great radio creator and film director and theater director, was supported by the WPA during this period. And some incredible work came out of this. Some incredible artistic work came out of that whole. You should really read about the WPA and all the artists involved with that. And a lot of their stuff still remains. That, you know, if you go to older banks and stuff like that, you'll see old like panoramic portraits in this kind of social realist style, and that was done through like the WPA thing. How do you do it? How do you get all this money? You know, that begs the question: how do you do it? Right? What did FDR do? Went to the rich, folks. He went to he came from that class, all right. But he went to his rich friends, and basically, the fact of the matter is that there was a lot of social unrest at this period. People were out of work, but people were organized too. The CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. There was a strong socialist movement in this country at that time that people have forgotten about, that was wiped out of the history books. There was also a very strong communist party in this country. A coalition was formed that started protests all around the country, and marches, protests, and there was a lot of violence too during this period. But FDR basically went to his rich cronies, you know, the rich and the CEOs, and said, listen, it's like, I'm not taking everything away from you. You can still have this relative wealth, but in order for us to get this economy going again, unfortunately, I'm going to tax the crap out of you. I'm going to have to tax the crap out of you, and you're still going to be wealthy, but, you know, and the rich were resistant. You know, half of them said, like, no way. There's no way we're doing this. You know, and his response was, listen, you can either, you know, do this and pacify all these people in this resistance movement, or you can deal with them directly. All right? Because that was the consequence, and they weren't going to be kind about it. You know, so a lot of them ended up capitulating in this thing. A lot of them ended up capitulating, and the rich were taxed. And they they battled tooth and nail about what the ultimately they all kind of capitulated and conceded to this 94% tax rate in 1943. And basically the tax rate was everything at that point. The equivalent in today's terms would have been about $350,000. That would have been about the income equivalent, after which 94% of every dollar you made after that would go back to Uncle Sam. And that's how he got all this money. That's how he got all this money. And he had even talked about having a an income ceiling that at a certain point, well, there was a kind of income ceiling at a certain point he created a maximum income that you could make a certain amount, and then after that, 100% of it went back to the government. And in today's terms, it was about $350,000. He taxed the rich, folks. The people that had the money, the people that were insanely wealthy, even at that point. You know, they had to kind of pay their share, and he saved the country. You know, he saved the government. Not only that, but it's and that wasn't the only thing that saved the economy. World War II had a lot. I'm sure some of you are at, well, what about World War? World War II put a lot of people back to work, and was the other piece of this. Was the other piece of the puzzle, and in this political climate nowadays, it's if you were to tax the rich to that, it's Trump did the exact opposite. Trump took a 35% tax rate on the upper income and dropped the corporate tax rate to 20%. Down from 94%, and that's why there's no money. And you would think that FDR would have been an unpopular president, and the fact of the matter is that he was a four-term. He was reelected for 4 terms. In fact, the Republicans after him, put a statute into place that it's they didn't want to see it happen again. They put a 2-term limit statute into the Constitution. You can only serve 2 terms after that. And that was that. But after all this, and after the dust cleared, the rich realized one thing. The rich realized, the first thing they were is, how are we going to, the rich doing what they usually do, and corporations doing what they usually do, work tooth and nail relentlessly. Like Sauron's army of orcs, they are relentless, and unless they're defeated, they got back up on this and started to tooth and nail dismantle every single one of these things that they had to concede to. One of the first things, because they were smart about it, they realized a couple things. One thing was this: they realized that if you polarize the rich and the poor to the degree that they were polarized at that point, being in a democratic society, right? The people would, use their vote to gain political power, to be able to continue to use that electoral mechanism to get the things that the people wanted. So what do? How do they supersede that? They start buying off the system. They start buying the corporate elite in this country started buying the political system off through lobbyists, through placing their own people in the Congress and the House of Representatives and the Senate. The whole thing became a mechanism for and we would see by the time of Reagan, we would see a political system that had been bought tooth and nail by the rich to serve their interests. And they rolled back tons of those different programs that had been in place to keep them in check. The other thing that they did was propagandistic. what they started to do is, in a very, very nuanced and sophisticated propaganda campaign, they started to build up this ideal in the American public about organized labor, this weird equivalency of, and there's a very, very strong organized labor movement in this country, right? They started to basically slander them and libel them to the degree that organized labor became, we can call it a meme almost. It became like the equivalent of like communism. You know, they accused organized labor, and there was a huge organized labor movement in this country. A lot of people, up to about, I believe, 30-something% of people were like in organized labor. It's down to about 7% of the public sector are in unions, right? So they started to dismantle the labor unions. The labor unions that were representing the workers, that were sticking up for the workers, that were having these, strikes, for better pay and better wages. They made sure that they dismantled that. Through this whole time, we have to realize that by the mid-50s, there is one superpower left, and it's the Soviet Union. And the Cold War starts. And this country starts a kind of witch hunt. And we talk about this in Intro to Mass Media, a witch hunt of paranoia, accusing a lot of people of having communist sympathies or socialist sympathies, so that through this very sophisticated form of Orwellian control of the media, people started to equate. There was what they call the Red Scare, and some of your grandparents or your parents will remember times when there would be people were building fallout shelters because they thought there was going to be nuclear war, and schools would have almost like fire drills, like drills where kids would all get under, it was like shelter in place. But it wasn't about active shooters. It was about, the Russians launching. We wanted to be prepared, so we had these shelter in place exercises. So that's the way that they dismantled organized labor. So that by the time in the mid-70s, when the major corporations start to outsource a majority of the jobs, a majority of the American jobs to other countries, right? There was the organized labor was so anemic, they really couldn't do anything. There was no laws put on the books about outsourcing, so they were pretty much left powerless. And what would happen would be that they couldn't stop the jobs from going over. The labor unions didn't have the clout, they didn't have the power to stop the jobs from going overseas. So their victories always had to do with holding on to workers, right? It's for instance, let's say Westinghouse was going to ship 20,000 workers out to, China or Bangladesh or wherever they were going. It's the unions would try to fight with them to keep 4,000 or something. And they would look at that as a victory, which was really no victory at all. We were losing our jobs. We were losing our manufacturing base. And the corporations who made huge profits out of this could care less, really. We talked about all this. They did it, and it wasn't cheap to move all this stuff. All that surplus we were talking about, and this graph back here, all this extra surplus that they had, a lot of that surplus was used to go into the logistical infrastructure. It's moving all that stuff. Training workers in foreign countries, building factories in other countries, all the oil, all the shipping, moving all this stuff took millions and millions of dollars, but they had it. They were willing to put up that outsourcing capital in the beginning because they knew afterwards the dividends they were going to get from cheap labor were going to outweigh it. It was like putting money up front and making a whole bunch of money later on, and that's one of the ways that the surplus was used. What's different in this climate? What was different in 2008 when the economy collapsed then? This is the important takeaway. Any kind of organized labor resistance in 2008, nobody was organized. All of those different factions that had built a coalition to go up against the government and protest, that was by 2008, the crash of 2008, there really wasn't much going on. Organized labor had been absolutely castrated, and the only movement to come out of that would be a movement called Occupy Wall Street. After the crash and the bailout, there was this movement that started. Actually, believe it or not, I don't want to take credit for it. I didn't start it. In fact, it was a pain in my butt. But the first occupation took place when I was a grad student at the New School down in New York. They did an occupation about 2 years earlier of the student administrative buildings, because the then president of the school, Bob Kerrey, who had been a senator in North Dakota, he had all these somewhat scrupulous financial holdings and dealings in certain countries, and the kids were well informed, the students were well informed enough about it that they put huge pressure on the administration, and they occupied the building. They occupied buildings. And I can remember my first semester at the New School in New York, I was trying to go home for Christmas break, and I wanted to get some library books back. And the library at that time was in the student administration building on Fifth Avenue, and they had surrounded the building, and they wouldn't let me get in. So I was kind of mad at them because they were young, they were millennials, and they were kind of smile. All I can remember is this furry guy smiling at me with this grin, you can't get in, boomer. And I was thinking to myself, listen, little bro, it's I was fighting the power, man, when your mother was putting Pampers on you, but I was hey, whatever, man. It's so it starts, so that initiative, and we hadn't seen student buildings occupied up to that time to any degree since the 60s, right? But this way, and the New York Times reported on it. And a lot of that infrastructure would become instrumental in putting together Occupy Wall Street and Zuccotti Park. And Occupy Wall Street would be a thing. There was at one point there was just thousands of people, occupying Zuccotti Park right down there in the Wall Street district and the brokerage districts, and they built this whole makeshift. They had tents down there, and it was 24/7 and. I had a very, very fervent and hopeful belief that they were going to shut down the city. They were going to shut down the city. What happened with Occupy Wall Street was the fact that, one of the things was just the fact that winter was coming and it got cold. So Mike Bloomberg, who was then the mayor there, he just strong-armed him right out with a militarized police force. But Occupy went on all over the place. There was literally hundreds of cities where there was an Occupy movement going. Occupy Oakland and LA, and there was even a small Occupy Binghamton movement where they set up tents down on Court Street. But did they succeed in getting what they wanted? No. But at least it was the beginning signs of some kind of resistance that for 20 years had been, and they started using terminology about class, right? We started to have an open discussion once again about class that we hadn't had in this country since the late 60s. And this whole 1%, 99% meme became a thing out of Occupy, what's different today and the primary difference between what is going on today, not to mention like the whole like shelter in place thing that is disallowing. Now we're starting to see, these somewhat morally equivocal protests in different towns to get back to work. But I mean, one of the things that's a deterrent from organized resistance right now around this unemployment is the whole shelter in place scenario that is disallowing people to get together. So what was different? There was a movement back then that threatened the rich, organized labor strikes. We're in fragments now. We're disarrayed, and we're trying to get it back together. But we're starting to see signs of coalitions starting to form, and I fervently believe that what we're going to see is some type of like movement in this country that will be based on a coalition of different, right now, fragmented groups like Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement. And I've even heard, it's a lot of you I've told a lot of you in the past, and one of my best friends is like this member of the far right, and he clues me into little things like the news doesn't report, and come to find out, and somebody should dig and do a little more research on this, that there have been meetings between factions of the far left in this country, like Antifa and the Black Bloc, and factions of like the 3%, the Patriot movement, unbeknownst and unreported by the media, that these people are finally starting to sit down at the table and talk about who the true enemy is. And that's a very, very hopeful sign. That's a very, very hopeful sign of people putting their internecine differences together to get some social and economic change going in this country. And we'll see what happens with that. It's like, one has reasons for optimism. We are in a system that has been spinning out of control since 2008. Occupy Wall Street had failed, and since then, the gains that have been made in an economy that had ultimately collapsed were over-reported, were over-exaggerated, always had to do with certain indicators, like levels of trading or whatever, or rises in employment. But the rises in employment usually didn't involve jobs that provided a living wage. But once again, the mainstream corporate media analysis wanted to say that not only had the economy recovered, but the economy was more robust than ever. And it was all built on smoke and mirrors. And every economist that was worth his weight in salt realized during this entire period, including guys like Richard Wolff and Thomas Piketty and all these famous economists, were trying to tell people, listen, this so-called recovery is built on sand. And that what these economists also knew was that we were due for a downturn even before COVID-19, even before all that. The expectations were for a significant downturn in an economy that had not even recovered from 2008. A downturn in an economy that hadn't bounced back from the crash. So that was all a perfect storm. And what we're seeing now is just a monkey wrench thrown into an economy that was already teetering with due to COVID-19, and it's going to be very, very interesting to see how all this is going to come out in the wash, and how we're going to deal with it, and we'll talk more about that on the blog. finally going to get into Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle. This is all the lead up. This is the lead up to what Debord will say ultimately in Society of the Spectacle. Debord was French. He was and he came up as a French intellectual at a time when that was very, very ripe with student revolt and activism and the anti-war movement, both in this country and abroad. There was a lot of things going on in 1968, including this huge student revolution in France, in Paris, and some of the other cities that involved thousands of students protesting, basically protesting imperialism and capitalism. And the same thing was going on in this country. And the demonstrations, and let's not kid ourselves, it wasn't all civility. The demonstrations got really, really violent. And people were killed, and people got their heads busted open, both on that side of the Atlantic and this side. You know, let's not forget what happened in Kent State, at Kent State University, when 4 anti-war protesters were just murdered in cold blood by the National Guard. You know, and a huge outcry. It caused a huge outcry and a huge anti-war sentiment. It was stuff like that. You know, it was, you know, the militarized law enforcement apparatus of this country, just murdering kids, that ultimately would formulate itself in the sentiment to stop the war. So Debord comes up. He's older. He's writing about. He's a Marxist. So he is pretty much indoctrinated into. And there was a very, very strong, and there still is. There was a very, very strong communist and socialist party in France and in a lot of those countries, in a lot of the European countries. He starts a movement of artists and intellectuals that was originally called the Lettrist movement. The Lettrist movement, they were artists and they were intellectuals, and they were writing about and organizing and writing novels and making films and doing all that as a kind of resistance to the established order. And finally it would kind of morph into this group called the Situationists. The Situationists. They would be this group, this fairly sizable group of French intellectuals and writers who were writing and thinking about how we could reshape society and what was wrong with it. And Debord would be one of the leading members of that. He writes a book called The Society of the Spectacle in 1967, right before the student riots. It's polemical, all right? Polemical meaning that it's a strong, harsh critique on the prevailing order. Because what is novel about Debord in terms of Marxism is that Debord wants to rethink Marx's ideas on everything from alienation to false consciousness to the whole relationship of base and superstructure, alienated labor, in terms of mass media, electronic telecommunications, and how this system, this class system, had pretty much bought and used mass media as a kind of propagandistic instrument to not only keep us ideologically docile, but also to kind of keep us separate. He makes a big deal about this whole idea of separation, of not being together, of not being in groups, of not being able to form collectively anymore due to this huge matrix that had been created through the mass media called the spectacle. And he'll talk in depth about what the spectacle is. And for him, the spectacle is something very sophisticated and complicated. Hence, throughout the beginning of chapter 1, different sections will start with the spectacle is this and the spectacle is that. Because in order for us to get our heads wrapped around what the spectacle essentially is. It's this kind of multifaceted aspect of society that isn't just, it's not just about labor. It's not just about money. It's not just about politics. It's about the way that our lives and our sense of identity has been distorted and corrupted by this mechanism of 24/7 propaganda that we already see in Berger. Berger will talk about publicity at the end of Ways of Seeing. And Debord will be even more, will even go further than Berger in saying that it's even worse than that. It's even worse than that. This is and this is its end game, and this is what it does. It and it's like I was talking to Douglas Lane about it. It's like the last chapter in Debord definitely kind of cross over and have a lot of similar ideas. But the things that Debord will say will be a lot more chilling. Almost. In 1960, it's like. People really, it's a polemical and prescient indictment of our image-saturated consumer culture. The book examines what Debord calls the spectacle. It's his term for the everyday manifestation of capitalist-driven phenomena. All right? Advertising, television, film, and celebrity. In the book, he'll talk about how the cult of celebrity and our obsession with celebrities and their lives plays into the spectacle and what the celebrity represents, right? So this group is working, and a couple of different things that Debord came up with. I want to just get to this right now because we had been talking about it. I know that I put the film version. He made a film after he did the book of called Society of the Spectacle. And if you've watched the film that I've posted, it's basically using this idea that he calls détournement, which is a coin that he terms for taking the imagery and taking ads and imagery and iconic stuff that the spectacle was using and basically flipping it or turning it or making it ironic. And you guys are like totally, you guys are old hands at this in terms of turning things into memes. Debord would have said like all of that kind of stuff. Like I remember like Adbusters magazine, spoofing stuff and turning it as being the opposite. Here we have some examples of what he was talking about, how art would be this fundamental way of helping to start, raising awareness and consciousness. We have this one, with somebody from Guantanamo, and it's a spoof on the iPad, the American flag with 50, instead of having 50 stars, it has 50 signs for different corporations, and this thing with the Queen. And this idea of détournement that that he felt was a viable way of fighting back against the spectacles, like overarching, like the spectacle was just so monolithic and so inscrutable and so formidable that it was like we would see and different aspects of this in urban culture, like graffiti is a form of like artistic protest. Guys like Banksy and guys like Basquiat and all these, like, and hip hop and punk and all these things would directly come out of some of the things that Debord was talking about. All those kind of movements in culture to like call culture out on its shit. The book starts, and every chapter starts with a quote from some intellectual. The very first chapter starts with a quote by Ludwig von Feuerbach, who was a German philosopher who was a contemporary of Marx's, and Marx had read a lot of Feuerbach. And the quote is, he starts the book with this quote, "But for the present age, which prefers the sign to the thing signified, the copy to the original, representation to reality, appearance to essence, truth is considered profane," right? When the truth no longer exists, when everything has been turned into its opposite, that which was initially sacred, the truth, is flipped into being something profane, and something that you don't do. The truth is considered profane, and only illusion is sacred. Back to Berger, back to Sontag, back to the Matrix. Illusion is sacred. Sacredness is in fact held to be enhanced in proportion as truth. As truth decreases and illusion increases, so that the highest degree of illusion comes to be the highest degree of sacredness. This is the quote that Debord will start his analysis with. The truth has been turned into the profane. Illusion reigns everywhere. He writes in this style in paragraphs, and these kind of condensed ideas that are called aphorisms. That's the technical aphorisms. Aphorisms are a way of writing where you just have these kind of concentrated ideas. Instead of having chapters, he just has these like blocks of ideas, and then he moves on to the next idea. And he does like 200 of these throughout the book. But in the first one he says, in societies dominated by modern conditions of production, life is, and he's writing in 1967, life is presented as an immense accumulation of spectacles. Everything that was directly lived has receded into a representation. Everything that had previously been lived, he said, has been turned into a form of representation. And what does he mean? He's positing the idea that in the past, you kind of had your ontological existential bearings in life, and that we were more connected with each other and with nature and with ourselves and with our jobs. We talked about like this whole period coming up during a time before industrial society where things were more holistic. They were less fragmented. People were more centered. There wasn't this mass proliferation of different types of, and we've been talking a lot in the other class right now because we're doing psychoanalytic criticism about mental health, and wellness, and the ways in which the society generates anxiety and mental illness, and this whole new cottage industry of like ways of dealing with it. Everything that was directly lived in the past has receded into something that isn't real, that we can't get a hold of anymore. So he posits this duality that between this kind of illusion that we're in and a real life that existed at one point. It's very much like the Matrix, right? He says in number 2, he says the images detached from every aspect of life merge into a common stream. That the images merge into this common, and he'll say a lot about this whole idea about how the whole thing seems to appear as just being this kind of chorus of different conflicting voices and images and ideas and political parties and brands. But he'll say kind of the same thing that Berger will say, that it seems to have this fragmented nature to it, but ultimately it's all of the same piece. It all has like the same goal. This whole idea of it being a common stream in which the unity of that life can no longer be recovered. The this idea of this lost unity that we had with each other and ourselves has been lost and fragmented due to this immersion into this hall of mirrors called the spectacle. Fragmented views of reality regroup themselves into a new unity as a separate pseudo-world. A pseudo-world that isn't, pseudo meaning it's not the real world. You know, it doesn't really have any bearing on the real world. But we're immersed in it. You know, like a fish in an aquarium. It's like it's our world. You know, that can only be looked at. He'll make He'll make a very, very important point about this idea of healthy engagement and activity. He'll make this dichotomy, this dualism, this binary opposition between this active engagement and living of one's life with the mere spectator's passivity and spectatorship, and kind of taking a sideline on the whole idea of actually living. He'll set up that polarity between this kind of contemplation of life that puts us in a totally passive role as the spectator, and a world in which we are actively engaged in life. The spectacle generates passivity in us, and docility, and this kind of just looking at the world as opposed to actually being in the world in any kind of healthy way. The specialization of images of the world evolves into a world of autonomized images where even the deceivers are deceived. Even the deceivers are deceived, and we get. You want to know more about this? Look at the lectures that we did in Com 240 on ideological criticism and ideology, and how there's this whole assumption. You know, there's always these conspiratorial assumptions that there's some inner chamber. You know, there's some, whether it be the Skull and Bones Society, a New World Order, or whatever, that is actively making these decisions to control the masses. And what Debord wants to say is that even those people, even the producers in Hollywood, even the Ted Turners and the Rupert Murdochs and the Mark Zuckerbergs in the world, he'll say something very startling, and he'll say they're dupes too. That they're being duped by a system, and they're just generating this stuff just like the masses. That there's nobody behind the wheel, and that the system has just created alienation for everybody involved, including those who seem to be at the top of the heap, right? The spectacle is a concrete inversion of life, an autonomous movement of the non-living. What does he mean? A concrete inversion of life. During chapter 1, he takes a lot of time and effort to say that ultimately what he's going to say is that the world, and it's not unlike the question that Neo poses to Morpheus about the Matrix. He's like, wait a minute, if this thing doesn't exist, can it kill us? It's like, and Morpheus is like, yeah, it's like the body is involved with it. So that, you know, Debord will put a lot of emphasis on the idea that even though this is an illusion, it's concrete. It's a concrete illusion. It has it's like, you know, people die. I mean, it's like, you know, thousands of bodies die in wars that are generated through the spectacle. You know, the spectacle can kill people. It's like, you know, the spectacle controls our physiological being in terms of what we eat, what we don't. That there's a material. He wants to say that the illusion is an illusion, but it's a real illusion. You know, it's a real illusion. And he'll also make this whole point here, this autonomous movement of the non-living. He'll say that it's everything. He'll say that he'll want to say that it's images have created the sense of having a life, but they're really not alive in any like significant way. That we've given all this power up to that which is not alive, and it seems to have like gained a life of its own. Number 3, the spectacle presents itself simultaneously, and this is like, these are the things, these first like 10, 20 bullet points are the ones that you really have to kind of sink your brains into and understand, all right? Because I don't want to go any further, just as don't want to go any further than chapter 3 in the book, all right? I think that the rest of the book is really good, but once you get to chapter 4, he starts talking about things that really presuppose a lot of knowledge about the history of communism and Marxism and all that stuff, and it's like, it's all great in grad school, but it's just, it's like, I think that we can get everything that we need to out of the illustrated guide to this and the first 3 chapters as such, right? But he says in number 3, in chapter 1, the spectacle presents itself simultaneously as society itself, as a part of society, and as a means of unification. The spectacle presents itself simultaneously as society itself, as a part of society, and as a means of its unification. 3 different modes in which the spectacle operates. One, which begs the question, how can the spectacle operate as society and then as a part of society? We'll get to that. As a part of society, it is the focal point of all vision and all consciousness. He's talking about that point, that focal point of society that is all optically based. TV, videos, video games, newspapers, everything that approaches us in an optical, and I would say auditory form too, but primarily optical, that it is what we see, that presents itself as being, what he'll say is that the paradox is that this image of society is posing as society itself. This image of society is posing as society itself. It is but due to the very fact that this sector is separate, the spectacle is separate from society. It is in reality the domain of delusion and false consciousness. The fact that we mistake the spectacle and what goes on in the spectacle, in the news, on TV, in the theaters, on Facebook, on YouTube, the fact that we take that illusion of society for society itself is what drives the illusion that we've misplaced where we think society is actually occurring. It's not occurring on these screens. It's occurring out there with real flesh and blood. We can watch as many different news programs as you want to watch right now of bodies after bodies being hauled out of nursing homes and houses and hospitals. But it's a spectacle. It doesn't really exist for us in any kind of real way. We're just seeing what they choose to show us. Is it really happening? Yeah. But what we get, what we get skimmed off from it is not any kind of reality that we can really wrap our heads around, unless it hits home in some kind of way, where people, you actually, but even then, but due to the very fact that this sector is separate, it is in reality the domain of delusion and false consciousness. The unification it achieves is nothing but an official language of universal separation. An official language of universal separation. The irony here is that what he's trying to, and it's important that we point to number 4 too in connection with number 3. He says he's like, no, okay. So he's like posing a lot of paradoxes here because he'll say like the spectacle is this. The spectacle is this whole tableau. Think of the word tableau, this whole kind of diorama that we're immersed in of all these conflicting images. And but he'll say that the spectacle is not a collection of images. It is a social relation between people that is mediated by images. The spectacle is not a collection of images. It is a social relation between people that is mediated by images. That it's not about the show. It's not about Facebook. It's not about YouTube. It's about what it does to my relationship with you and your relationship with the people around you, and how the spectacle mediates that relationship and distorts it. And I have a picture here in the corner of kids on their phone. It's like, in the illustrated guide, we'll get to that, right? In fact, we're going to get to it right now. Like, if you're having a hard time, I know people are having a hard time with the actual text, but the illustrated guide is very, very. The essay called "The Illustrated Guide to Debord Society of the Spectacle" is a lot clearer. There's cartoon pictures. It's like, if you're not getting the book, definitely go to the essay and at least read and pick that essay apart and read it a couple times, and then you'll get it. But what the article says is Debord defines the spectacle as the, quote, autocratic reign of the market economy. The autocratic reign, once again, it's something else. First it was the optical part of it. Now it's the reign of because for Debord, the spectacle is all these things. It's like, you got to understand like the paradox of like the parts being, the whole being more than the sum of the parts. The whole of what Debord wants to call the spectacle is more than just the sum of the parts. It's the relations that is formed. It is the way that we talked about the base and the superstructure, I believe, or it's like false consciousness, right? It's all these things. Though the term mass media is often used to describe the spectacle's form, Debord derides its neutrality. He says that mass media is like too neutral a term for what is going on. It's too neutral a term. Because it's like if we just leave it at the level of mass media, then it's just kind of this thing that is neutral. When really it is active and aggressively engaged in this process of dehumanizing us, right? Rather, it's like Debord derides its. He's like, this is not a neutral thing. He says, rather than talk of the spectacle, people often prefer to use the term media, he writes. And by this, they mean to describe a mere instrument, a kind of public service, right? When we talk about like, when Joe Schmo says, well, the media is doing this, it's the media, it's like, it's just such an intangible, non-definable, blanket, neutral, it doesn't really define media as such. When I say, when Trump, goes after the media, it's like, what does that even mean? It doesn't really. There's no part of that that really has any kind of meaningful, operational function. When we just gloss over the media, we don't get it, right? Rather than talk of the spectacle, it's like he writes, instead, Debord described the spectacle as capitalism's instrument for distracting and pacifying the masses. Capitalism's instrument to distract you from what is real and pacify you, like a pacifier. Think about a pacifier. To kind of keep you, from, wanting to rise above, like recognizing the true nature of your situation, as being like terrible, and doing something about it. It creates this illusion that we immerse ourselves in. Debord, the spectacle takes on many more forms today than it did, and this was written just a couple years ago, this essay, right? The spectacle takes on many more forms today than it did during Debord's lifetime. We got to remember, Debord passed away in 1994. He wouldn't even see the World Wide Web, which only comes into being in 98, and he wouldn't see. And what the writers have to say about that. It can be found on every screen that you look at. It is the advertisements plastered on the subway and the pop-up ads that appear in your browser. It is the listicle telling you, quote, 10 things you need to know about X. And we all fall prey to them. The spectacle reduces, it's and it's a distraction mechanism. The whole thing is kind of set up, and I fall prey to it as much as anybody. When I'm trying to multitask, or I'm trying to, educate. It's learning difficult things usually requires a level of focus that is made very, very hard to do in this kind of world of pop-ups and trying to do all this kind of stuff at once. To even try to read a book like Society of the Spectacle or Berger's Ways of Thinking takes sustained concentration and focus that the spectacle now does everything within its power to disrupt, right? The true learning of something usually has to do with this focused attention that is being dismantled. The spectacle reduces reality to an endless supply of commodifiable fragments. Think about all the things that you can buy in a game for real money, for real currency. The ways in which people derive an income from totally illusory content that they produce. Influencers. Including not me. It's my YouTube videos are the exact opposite of that. But the spectacle reduces reality to an endless supply of commodifiable fragments while encouraging us to focus on appearance. For Debord, this constituted an unacceptable degradation of our lives. He says that this is unacceptable, that this isn't the way that we were supposed to, this isn't the way that we're supposed to live. He'll be that polemical about it. The difference between Marx and Debord, the ways in which Debord will take Marx to the next level, has to do with this contrast. For Marx, the wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities. For Marx, Marx was still living in a continuum where things were objective, or material things that could be bought and sold and held and driven and worn. What Debord will say is, in societies where modern conditions of production, he'll riff on it. He'll basically do a riff on Marx. And he'll say, in societies where modern conditions of production prevail, all of life presents itself as an immense accumulation of spectacles. Everything that was directly lived has moved away into a representation. It's and this isn't, that hard of a case to make. Think about the ways in which, in a very, very short period of time, over the last 20, 30 years, all this, the economy, has basically been turned into this immaterial. The market itself exists in this kind of virtual realm where there's no cash anymore. It's all about algorithms and transactions in the market. I mean, the market was always this kind of mythical beast that didn't really exist, as such. The market was never something you could reach out and touch and hold. But now it's even moved more and more into immaterialism. And that the labor, even this whole migration from making stuff to generating data, what they call immaterial labor, right? That we're not making stuff anymore. We're transacting in illusions and symbols, and they're defining the whole economy. Most of the economy now consists of what? It doesn't consist of iron. It doesn't consist of pork bellies. It doesn't consist of the dairy industry. It consists primarily of ones and zeros, of virtual information that is bought and sold. Right? Debord observed that the spectacle actively alters human interactions. It's active. This is the idea of not being neutral. That it actively it's not just this thing we're looking at. It's like Facebook, Instagram, Netflix. It's actively engaged in producing this effect of separation. Debord observed that the spectacle actively alters human interactions and relationships. Images influence our lives and beliefs on a daily basis. Advertising manufactures new desires and aspirations. We already got this from Berger. The media interprets and reduces the world for us. The media interprets the world for us. It defines what the world is, not us. It defines what is important and what is not important. It defines what is worthy of your attention and what isn't. Whether it be, whether it be cases of COVID-19, the way that the third world has always been, this hotbed of total destitution compared to now. It hides stuff. It wants to talk about, and I got pissed off the other day at Glenn Greenwald, and Bongiorno took him to task about this overemphasis on. It's like right now. It's like I understand why people have this vested, all this energy invested in talking about the election. Talking about the upcoming election, but the way things are, it's like people bandy about electoral politics because they got nothing better to do, than talk about the Democrat. It's like I was like, dude, you're worried about what color drapes we're gonna have in November when the house is burning down right now. The house is burning down right now. You're worried about what color the drapes are going to be in November, and it's just the ways in which the media tries to tell us what's important and what's not. Is that stuff important? Yeah, but there's a continuum right now of what's important right now, today, on this date, today, 4/18/2020, in terms of keeping yourself alive, in terms of keeping your loved ones safe, of being able to sift through all the masses of misinformation and propaganda in order to get the takeaways that we really need in order to take care of ourselves, and that's a task. The media interprets and reduces the world for us with the use of simple narratives. It comes up with ideas and memes that it tries to sell back to us in these bite-sized ideas so that we can kind of talk about them in these somewhat elementary and moronic ways. The whole idea of flattening the curve. Flattening the curve. It makes things simplistic. As if there was an actual curve out there and it was being flattened, as opposed to this particular physiological organic phenomena that seems to be a lot more sophisticated than just flattening the curve. It has peaks. It's just, it operates in a way that we want to simplify, and we're not doing ourselves justice when we're simplifying this thing. We're not doing justice to this. And the people, and until we understand this thing as something sophisticated and with a life and with a blowback and it's like, opportunistic diseases are called that for a reason. They find ways to continue to multiply. That is their goal. But I'm getting off point here. The media interprets and reduces the world for us in the use of simple narratives. Photography and film collapses time and geographic distance, providing the illusion of universal connectivity. All of this architecture, this digital apparatus, this hall of mirrors of Zoom and Collaborate and Facebook and all these things that create this illusion that we're connected in some kind of organic, species-wide level, which is the very opposite of what that would involve. The very opposite of connectedness is these illusions of connectedness, and that if any of you watch that video on the COVID-19 update that I did by Dr. Harriet Fraud, talking about how it's good to stay connected, but there's some downside. It's kind of got this deleterious, these phony connections might be doing more harm than good. These phony connections of FaceTime and all of this might be doing more harm than good, because after everything is said and done, when we recognize our physicality, our physiognomical basis, our concrete existence in the world, and how we vibe with people, and how it's like the Matrix talks about how we are these centers of biochemical energy. That we need we don't just need somebody smiling on the I don't just need somebody smiling on the screen saying, "I miss you, Uncle Nicky." I need to be able to touch that kid. I need to be able to mess his hair up. I need to be able to, there's been tons of clinical research done on the idea that an infant in an incubator, if an infant is removed from any kind of human influence, if an infant is not touched or cooed to or held or given any kind of biomagnetic feedback, that infant dies, and they don't even understand. It's like it will die. The infant will die. For no apparent etiological reason except for the fact that it was just not touched. All this kind of physiological connectedness that we have to each other is somehow as important as drinking water. To be apart, to be amongst people, to be touching, to be messing around, having play. Kids know this. They're always climbing all over each other and all that. It's part of life, And to be separated and to be disconnected and be getting this pale facsimile of connectedness is just really, really doing us a disservice mentally and really wearing a lot of people down. How do we confront it? How do we deal with it? We'll talk about that in the next lecture. I hope everybody's well. I miss you guys. I miss normal life. But I'm doing the best I can. It's like the Metrons are coming to save us, by the way. It is true. Whatever I said about it being bullshit, they are coming. Just hold on. All right? Just hold on. They'll be here in their motherships. and they will disintegrate all the bad people, that are not giving us our respirators and not giving us our masks and like holding out on the money. All of them will be disintegrated in the first wave, and then all the good people will be cured, and then you think I'm lying, don't you? Have a good one.